Mrs. Hanshaw's visiphone signaled genteelly at 3:10 p.m. that day. Mrs. Hanshaw guessed the caller, and having activated the receiver, saw that she had guessed correctly. A quick glance in the mirror to see that she was properly calm after a day of abstracted concern and worry, and then she keyed in her own transmission. "Yes, Miss Robbins," she said coldly. Richard's teacher was a bit breathless. She said, "Mrs. Hanshaw, Richard has deliberately left through the fire door, although I told him to use the regular door. I do not know where he went." Mrs. Hanshaw said, carefully, "He left to come home." Miss Robbins looked dismayed. Do you approve of this?" Pale-faced, Mrs. Hanshaw set about putting the teacher in her place. "I don't think it's up to you to criticize. If my son does not choose to use the door, it is his affair and mine. I don't think there is any school ruling that would force him to use the door, is there?" Her bearing quite plainly intimated that if there were, she would see to it that it was changed. Miss Robbins flushed and had time for one quick remark before contact was broken. She said, "I'd have him probed. I really would." Mrs. Hanshaw remained standing before the quartzinium plate, staring blindly at its blank face. Her sense of family placed her for a few moments quite firmly on Richard's side. Why did he have to use the door if he chose not to? And then she settled down to wait. And pride battled the gnawing anxiety that something, after all, was wrong with Richard. He came home with a look of defiance on his face, but his mother, with a strenuous effort at self-control, met him as though nothing were out of the ordinary. For weeks, she followed that policy. "It's nothing," she told herself. "It's a vagary. He'll grow out of it." It grew into an almost normal state of affairs. Then, too, every once in a while, perhaps 3 days in a row, she would come down to breakfast to find Richard waiting sullenly at the door, then using it when school time came. She always refrained from commenting on the matter. Always, when he did that, and especially when he followed it up by arriving home via the door, her heart grew warm, and she thought, well, it's over. But always with the passing of 1 day, 2 or 3, he would return like an addict to his drug and drift silently out by the door, small d, before she woke. And each time she thought despairingly of psychiatrists and probes, and each time the vision of Miss Robbins's low-bred satisfaction at possibly learning of it stopped her, although she was scarcely aware that that was the true motive. Meanwhile, she lived with it and made the best of it. The mechano was instructed to wait at the door, small d, with a Turgo kit and a change of clothing. Richard washed and changed without resistance. His underthings, socks, and flexies were disposable in any case, and Mrs. Hanshaw bore uncomplainingly the expense of daily disposal of shirts. Trousers she finally allowed to go a week before disposal, on condition of rigorous nightly cleansing. One day she suggested that Richard accompany her on a trip to New York. It was more a vague desire to keep him in sight than part of any purposeful plan. He did not object. He was even happy. He stepped right through the door unconcerned. He didn't hesitate. He even lacked the look of resentment he wore on those mornings he used the door to go to school. Mrs. Hanshaw rejoiced. This could be a way of weaning him back into door usage, and she racked her ingenuity for excuses to make trips with Richard. She even raised her power bill to quite unheard-of heights by suggesting, and going through with, a trip to Canton for the day in order to witness a Chinese festival. That was on a Sunday, and the next morning, Richard marched directly to the hole in the wall he always used. Mrs. Hanshaw, having wakened particularly early, witnessed that. For once, badgered past endurance, she called after him plaintively, "Why not the door, Dickie?" He said, briefly, "It's all right for Canton," and stepped out of the house. So that plan ended in failure. And then, one day, Richard came home soaking wet. The mechano hovered above him uncertainly, and Mrs. Hanshaw, just returned from a 4-hour visit with her sister in Iowa, cried, "Richard Hanshaw!" He said, hangdog fashion, It started raining. All of a sudden, it started raining." For a moment, the word didn't register with her. Her own school days and her studies of geography were 20 years in the past. And then she remembered. and caught the vision of water pouring recklessly and endlessly down from the sky, a mad cascade of water with no tap to turn off, no button to push, no contact to break. She said, "And you stayed out in it?" He said, "Well, gee, Mom, I came home as fast as I could. I didn't know it was going to rain." Mrs. Hanshaw had nothing to say. She was appalled, and the sensation filled her too full for words to find a place. 2 days later, Richard found himself with a running nose and a dry, scratchy throat. Mrs. Hanshaw had to admit that the virus of disease had found a lodging in her house as though it were a miserable hovel of the Iron Age. It was over that her stubbornness and pride broke, and she admitted to herself that, after all, Richard had to have psychiatric help. Mrs. Hanshaw chose a psychiatrist with care. Her first impulse was to find one at a distance. For a while, she considered stepping directly into the San Francisco Medical Center and choosing one at random. And then it occurred to her that by doing that, she would have become merely an anonymous consultant. She would have no way of obtaining any greater consideration for herself than would be forthcoming to any public door user of the city slums. Now, if she remained in her own community, her word would carry weight. She consulted the district map. It was one of that excellent series prepared by Doors Incorporated and distributed free of charge to their clients. Mrs. Hanshaw couldn't quite suppress that little thrill of civic pride as she unfolded the map. It wasn't a fine print directory of door coordinates only. It was an actual map with each house carefully located. And why not? District A3 was a name of moment in the world, a badge of aristocracy. It was the first community on the planet to have been established on a completely doored basis. The first, the largest, the wealthiest, the best known. It needed no factories, no stores. It didn't even need roads. Each house was like a little secluded castle, the door of which had entry anywhere the world over where other doors existed. Carefully, she followed down the keyed listing of the 5,000 families of District A3. She knew it included several psychiatrists. The learned professions were well represented in A3. Dr. Hamilton Sloan was the second name she arrived at, and her finger lingered upon the map. His office was scarcely 2 miles from the Hanshaw residence. She liked his name. The fact that he lived in A3 was evidence of worth. And he was a neighbor. Well, practically a neighbor. He would understand that it was a matter of urgency and confidential. Firmly, she put in a call to his office to make an appointment. Dr. Hamilton Sloan was a comparatively young man, not quite 40. He was of good family, and he had indeed heard of Mrs. Hanshaw. He listened to her quietly and then said, "And all this began with the door breakdown." "That's right, Doctor." "Does he show any fear of the doors?" "Of course not. What an idea." She was plainly startled. "It's possible, Mrs. Hanshaw, it's possible. After all, when you stop to think of how a door works, it is rather a frightening thing, really. You step into a door, and for an instant your atoms are converted into field energies, transmitted to another part of space, and reconverted into matter. For that instant, you're not alive. I'm sure no one thinks of such things. But your son may. He witnessed the breakdown of the door. He may be saying to himself, what if the door breaks down just as I'm halfway through? But that's nonsense. He still uses the door. He's even been to Canton with me, Canton, China. And as I told you, he uses it for school about once or twice a week. Freely? Cheerfully? Well, said Mrs. Hanshaw reluctantly, he does seem a bit put out by it, but really, Doctor, there isn't much use talking about it, is there? If you would do a quick probe, see where the trouble was. And she finished on a bright note. Why, that would be all. I'm sure it's quite a minor thing. Dr. Sloan sighed. He detested the word probe, and there was scarcely any word he heard oftener. Mrs. Hanshaw, he said patiently, there is no such thing as a quick probe. Now, I know the mag strips are full of it, and it's a rage in some circles, but it's much overrated.
Are you serious?
Quite. The probe is very complicated, and the theory is that it traces mental circuits. You see, the cells of the brains are interconnected in a large variety of ways. Some of those interconnected paths are more used than others. They represent habits of thought, both conscious and unconscious. Theory has it that if these paths in any given brain can be used to diagnose mental ills early and with certainty. Well, then, but subjection to the probe is quite a fearful thing, especially to a child. It's a traumatic experience. It takes over an hour, and even then the results must be sent to the Central Psychoanalytical Bureau for analysis, and that could take weeks. And on top of all that, Mrs. Hanshaw, there are many psychiatrists who think the theory of probe analyses to be most uncertain. Mrs. Hanshaw compressed her lips. You mean nothing can be done? Dr. Sloane smiled. Not at all. There were psychiatrists for centuries before there were probes. I suggest that you let me talk to the boy.
Talk to him? Is that all?
Oh, I'll come to you for background information where necessary, but the essential thing, I think, is to talk to the boy.
Really, Dr. Sloane? I doubt if he'll discuss the matter with you. He won't talk to me about it, and I'm his mother.
That often happens, the psychiatrist assured her. A child will sometimes talk more readily to a stranger. In any case, I cannot take the case otherwise. Mrs. Hanshaw rose, not at all pleased.
When can you come, Doctor?
What about this coming Saturday? The boy won't be in school. Will you be busy?
We will be ready.
She made a dignified exit. Dr. Sloane accompanied her through the small reception room to his office door and waited while she punched the coordinates of her house. He watched her pass through. She became a half-woman, a quarter-woman, an isolated elbow and foot, a nothing. It was frightening. Did a door ever break down during passage, leaving half a body here and half there? He had never heard of such a case, but he imagined it could happen. He returned to his desk and looked up the time of his next appointment. It was obvious to him that Mrs. Hanshaw was annoyed and disappointed at not having arranged for a psychic probe treatment. Why, for God's sake? Why should a thing like the probe, an obvious piece of quackery in his own opinion, get such a hold on the general public? It must be part of this general trend towards machines. Anything man can do, machines can do better. Machines, more machines, machines for anything and everything. Oh, tempora, oh, mores, oh, hell. His resentment of the probe was beginning to bother him. Was it a fear of technological unemployment? A basic insecurity on his part? Mechanophobia, if that was the word? He made a mental note to discuss this with his own analyst. Dr. Sloane had to feel his way. The boy wasn't a patient who had come to him, more or less anxious to talk, more or less anxious to be helped. Under the circumstances, it would have been best to keep the first meeting with Richard short and non-committal. It would have been sufficient merely to establish himself as something less than a total stranger. The next time, he would be someone Richard had seen before. The time after, he would be an acquaintance. And after that, a friend of the family. Unfortunately, Mrs. Hanshaw was not likely to accept a long, drawn-out process. She would go searching for a probe, and of course she would find it. And harm the boy. He was certain of that. It was for that reason he felt he must sacrifice a little of the proper caution and risk a small crisis. An uncomfortable 10 minutes had passed when he decided he must try. Mrs. Hanshaw was smiling in a rather rigid way, eyeing him narrowly, as though she expected verbal magic from him. Richard wriggled in his seat, unresponsive to Dr. Sloane's tentative comments, overcome with boredom and unable not to show it. Dr. Sloane said, with casual suddenness, "Would you like to take a walk with me, Richard?" The boy's eyes widened, and he stopped wriggling. He looked directly at Dr. Sloane. "A walk, sir?" "I mean, outside." "Do you go outside?" "Sometimes, when I feel like it." Richard was on his feet, holding down a squirming eagerness. "I didn't think anyone did." "I do, and I like company." The boy sat down, uncertainly. "Mom?" Mrs. Hanshaw had stiffened in her seat.
her compressed lips radiating horror. But she managed to say, "Why, certainly, Dickie, but watch yourself." And she managed a quick and baleful glare at Dr. Sloane. In one respect, Dr. Sloane had lied. He did not go outside, sometimes. He hadn't been in the open since early college days. True, he had been athletically inclined, still was to some extent. But in his time, the indoor ultraviolet chambers, swimming pools, and tennis courts had flourished. For those with the price, they were much more satisfactory than the outdoor equivalents, open to the elements as they could possibly be. There was no occasion to go outside. So there was a crawling sensation about his skin when he felt wind touch it, and he put down his flexied shoes on bare grass with a gingerly movement. "Hey, look at that!" Richard was quite different now, laughing, his reserve broken down. Dr. Sloane had time only to catch a flash of blue that ended in a tree. Leaves rustled, and he lost it. What was it?" "A bird," said Richard. "A blue kind of bird." Dr. Sloane looked around him in amazement. The Hanshaw residence was on a rise of ground, and he could see for miles. The area was only lightly wooded, and between clumps of trees, grass gleamed brightly in the sunlight. Colors set in deeper green made red and yellow patterns. They were flowers. From the books he had viewed in the course of his lifetime, and from the old video shows, he had learned enough so that all this had an eerie sort of familiarity. And yet the grass was so trim, the flowers so patterned. Dimly he realized he had been expecting something wilder. He said, "Who takes care of all this?" Richard shrugged. "I don't know. Maybe the mechanos do it." "Mechanos?" "Yeah, there's loads of them around. Sometimes they got a sort of atomic knife they hold near the ground. It cuts the grass. And they're always fooling around with the flowers and things. There's one of them over there." It was a small object half a mile away. Its metal skin cast back highlights as it moved slowly over the gleaming meadows, engaged in some sort of activity that Dr. Sloane could not identify. Dr. Sloane was astonished. Here it was a perverse sort of aestheticism, a kind of conspicuous consumption. "What's that?" he asked suddenly. Richard looked. He said, "That's a house. Belongs to the Frolics. Coordinates A323-461. That little pointy building over there is the public door." Dr. Sloane was staring at the house. Was that what it looked like from the outside? Somehow he had imagined something much more cubic and taller. "Come along," shouted Richard, running ahead. Dr. Sloane followed more sedately. "Do you know all the houses about here?" "Just about." "Where is A2326475? It was his own house, of course. Richard looked about. "Oh, let's see. Oh, sure. I know where it is. You see that water there?" "Water?" Dr. Sloane made out a line of silver curving across the green. "Sure. Real water. Just sort of running over rocks and things. It keeps running all the time. You can get across it if you step on the rocks. It's called a river." More like a creek, thought Dr. Sloane. He had studied geography, of course, but what passed for the subject these days was really economic and cultural geography. Physical geography was almost an extinct science, except among specialists. Still, he knew what rivers and creeks were, in a theoretical sort of way. Richard was still talking. "Well, just past the river, over that hill with the big clump of trees, and down the other side away is A2326475. It's a light green house with a white roof." "Is it?" Dr. Sloane was genuinely astonished. He hadn't known it was green. Some small animal disturbed the grass in its anxiety to avoid the oncoming feet. Richard looked after it and shrugged. "You can't catch them. I tried." A butterfly flitted past, a wavering bit of yellow. Dr. Sloane's eyes followed it. There was a low hum that lay over the fields, interspersed with an occasional harsh, calling sound, a rattle, a twittering, a chatter that rose, then fell. As his ear accustomed itself to listening, Dr. Sloane heard 1,000 sounds, and none were man-made. A shadow fell across the scene, advancing toward him, covering him. It was suddenly cooler, and he looked upward, startled. Richard said,
It's just a cloud. It'll go away in a minute. Hey, look at these flowers. They're the kind that smell.
They were several hundred yards from the Hanshaw residence. The cloud passed, and the sun shone once more. Dr. Sloane looked back and was appalled at the distance they had covered. If they moved out of sight of the house, and if Richard ran off, would he be able to find his way back? He pushed the thought away impatiently and looked out toward the line of water, nearer now, and past it to where his own house must be. He thought wonderingly, light green? He said, "You must be quite an explorer," Richard said, with a shy pride.
When I go to school and come back, I always try to use a different route and see new things.
But you don't go outside every morning, do you? Sometimes you use the doors, I imagine.
Oh, sure.
Why is that, Richard? Somehow Dr. Sloane felt there might be significance in that point. But Richard quashed him. With his eyebrows up and a look of astonishment on his face, he said,
"Well, gosh, some mornings it rains, and I have to use the door. I hate that, but what can you do? About 2 weeks ago, I got caught in the rain, and I..."
He looked automatically about. "Shall we go back now?" There was a quick disappointment on Richard's face.
"Ah, what for?"
"You remind me that your mother must be waiting for us."
"I guess so."
The boy turned. He pronounced it with exaggerated care.
"I'd go on a stratoliner and look at stars and clouds and things. Oh, boy, I was sure nuts."
"You'd pick some..." Mrs. Hanshaw seemed troubled, uncertain.
"You don't think it's abnormal then, Doctor?"
"Unusual taste. 100 years ago, our ancestors were all outside most of the time. Even today, I dare say there are a Hanshaw fiercely.
Not like an African or an ancestor?"
"That may be part of the sullen retreat, and it could eventually be dangerous."
"Then how can we persuade him to stop?"
And that set a pattern. He used the trip to school and back as an excuse to repeat that first and go outside without necessarily having to go anywhere in the process.
Don't you think he'll be willing? Matters remain so, must they? Won't he ever be normal again?
Forbidden. If you cooperate with him, show him that you don't disapprove, it will lose all. There is a little of the rebel in all of us, but it generally dies down as we grow old. Mrs. Hanshaw said,
"And you don't think of
nothing." His fingers hesitated an inch from the combination board, thinking of the door and the psychic probe and all the rising away from the board, and his feet turned away from the door.